Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be showing you how to build your very own poll system or voting system as a web application. Okay, so this right here is going to be a client server model, which means we're going to be using HTML, CSS and JavaScript to create this user interface right here, which is then going to communicate with the backend or the server side to of course retrieve a list of options and their percentages, as well as give us the ability to send off a new vote and actually save that to a JSON file. All right, so it's going to be a bit of everything in today's video. We're going to be using Node.js and Express for the server side. Going to be defining a couple of routes. We're going to be, reading JSON, saving JSON, things like that. So let's have a quick look at what the voting system is going to look like. So I can post a vote like this as an example, and we can see there it is going to save it. If I refresh the page, the vote is going to remain. And as we can see, I can now no longer vote for something else. I need to make a new tab here, and now we can see I'm able to then, have a new vote. So this right here is pretty straightforward, but I'm going to be leaving the source code for this project down below if you want to download and follow along. All right, so we're going to start on the server side. Okay, so I've got this directory right here called JS voting system. So we can make a new directory inside here called server. So everything related to the server side API is going to be inside this directory. So now we can create a new file called index.js for the main JavaScript entry point, and inside the terminal right here, we can simply cd into the server directory, and then we can say npm init-y to create a new Node.js project. So now we can simply include our dependencies. That's going to be a single dependency of Express. So we can say npm I express to of course install that, and now we're ready to go. So going inside the index.js, I just want to include Express and a couple of more things. So we can say const express equal to require express, pretty straightforward. And now two more lines, we're going to be including fs and path. So fs is going to be used for interacting with the JSON file, and path is going to be used to of course create a path to that particular JSON data file. So speaking of that JSON file, we can create a new file right here inside the server directory called data.json. And like I mentioned earlier, this file is going to be used to contain all of the options and a number of votes per option. So it's going to be done using an object here. So we can define those same three options that I showed you at the start of today's video. It's going to be JavaScript just like this as a string with 0 votes by default. Make the same line here for both TypeScript and the option called both. Okay, just like that. And they're all going to start as 0 votes. You guys can make it start at 1, 2 votes, whatever you want. You can even add more options if you want to, but I'm going to be starting my data like this. Of course, as the front end communicates with the back end here, it's going to update these values by 1 and so on. So we have the data file sorted. I wanted to stop here and just show you a piece of software called Insomnia, because I use this software as my API client when testing and building apps just like this. So you guys can use your own API client if you want to, or to be honest, as long as you follow the code correctly, you can just watch me do it. Okay, so if you want to, you can download Insomnia down below and of course get your own client running. But like I said, you can simply just watch this and you should be good to go anyway. You can just test in the browser. All right. So going back inside the VS Code file right here, we can now drop down here and we're going to be defining a couple of things. So the first thing to define here is going to be a constant called app equal to express just like this, and a new constant called data file equal to path.join directory name, and then data.json to of course create a nice path to our data file. Okay, Now, I just want to go inside the package.json and create a new script called start, which is just going to run node index.js. So now, if we drop down here, we can create or start up the Express server. So we're going to say here, app.listen on port 3000. Once it starts up, we can just say console.log server is running, just to confirm that for us. Save this and then drop down below npm start, and we should see here server is running, which means heading inside Insomnia, we can now test the server, make sure it's actually returning something. So make a new request right here. We can call this one something like, voting system, okay? It's going to be a get request. And now we're going to say here, HTTP localhost on port 3000 and press send, and we get cannot get /404 not found, which means the web server is actually running. Okay, cool. So now going back inside VS Code, the next step is going to be to give our web server the ability to receive data through a form post. Okay, we're going to be doing this by just saying here app.use express.url encoded, and then we're going to provide here an object which is going to simply say extended equal to true. So now, when the front end posts a vote to the back end here, it's going to be able to be retrieved, and we're going to be seeing how this works a bit later on. But for now, let's include that right up there. I'll just say here support posting form data with URL encoded. Okay, just like that. Now, we can simply create a new route. Okay, we're going to say app.get. So when a get request is made to /poll, we're going to do something. All right, we can say here request response, and we're going to simply say something like, just for now, right, we're going to say res.send hello. Okay, I'm going to save this, restart the server here. Okay, you can also use node-mon if you want to, but I'm going to just restart it manually. Now we can go back inside Insomnia and we can press send. We get nothing. If I do /poll here, press send, we get hello. So that's working. When you make the request to the poll endpoint here, and it's a get request, want to actually return that data. So we actually want to see something like this. If I go make a new file here, we want this, right? We want an array, okay, of 3 objects, okay? Label, JavaScript, just like this, right? And percentage equal to something like, 65. So we want to actually take this data file here with the number of votes, and in the response of this here, in this GET request, I want to tell the front end in a much more friendlier way, each option as an object in an array, its label, and its percentage. The front end doesn't care about the number of votes. It only cares about the percentage of this option compared to the rest of them. So basically, we want to see in the response here, okay, in the response, we want to see a JSON array of this right here. So label, TypeScript, let's just do something like, 25, and that remainder of that is not 10, so we can say both, and we'll say 10. So we want this in the response. To achieve that, going back inside the index.js, we're going to be doing a couple of things here. So let's firstly change this to an asynchronous function. So now we can begin to use the await keyword and those promises right up here, which I forgot to include. So my apologies, guys. Actually, on line 2, we're going to say .promises at the end of here to essentially retrieve those read and write methods as promise implementation. And this means now, back down here, we can start to use await to read that file. So we're going to say here, let data is equal to, I'll remove this, send hello. So data is going to be equal to json.parse. We're going to parse some JSON, convert this data file into a native JavaScript object. So we're going to parse await fs.read file going to the data file path, okay, at UTF-8. Just like that, right? So data now is going to be the JavaScript object for this here, okay? If I just do response.end and then I'll simply just console.log the data here just to make sure everything is good so far. So I'll save this, restart the server. I'm going to send the request off here. We get nothing, but in the console, we get this object right here, of course, being, our object version of this here. So now we have the data as a native JavaScript object. We can now simply define a new constant here called total votes, because in order to work out the percentage of a particular option, we need to know what the total amount of votes are for everything. Okay, so total votes is going to be equal to here object.values. So calling object.values and then passing in data here. So passing in this object to that method or that function is going to, I might zoom in here, sorry guys. Okay, so passing in your data object into this values method or function, it's going to essentially give you an array of 0, 0, and 0. Let's prove this. I'll log out total votes, restart the server, send it across, go back, and we get 0, 0, and 0. So now it's very straightforward. We'll say dot reduce, okay? Then we can just say here total and then n for number. Then say here, I might just zoom out again. Sorry guys, it's a bit hard to sort of manage this kind of thing sometimes, but so we're gonna say here, total plus equals n and starting at 0. So the reduce method is gonna take the array and reduce it down to a single value. I won't go into the reduce method in today's video. I've got a whole video dedicated to reduce if you're interested, but basically this total here is gonna be our finished result of the total votes. It's gonna run this function for every single number here. In this case here, of course, it's 0, 0, 0, so you get 0 as a result. But it's gonna run this function for every single number here and simply append that number to the total, giving us, of course, in this case, 0. So I'll just log out total votes again after this and save. And we can see if I was to make TypeScript 4 and both 7, 4 plus 7 is 11. So if I make the request here in the console, we get 11. So that's working. So now we can simply redefine what data is to now be something like object.entries and then passing in data once again. So now object.entries is going to give you a 2-dimensional array of your data JSON here. So now, given this, we can just say .map, okay, to basically grab every single key value pair here and convert it into something else, an object with label and percentage. So we'll say here .map, we're going to receive our label and the percentage, the total, let's just call it votes. So the label and the votes, so just JavaScript and 0 and then TypeScript and 4 for each one, right? We can now just say here, return, let's just add a parenthesis right here to make sure that's fine. So we can now say return, then we can just say something like this, label. So we can just say label here. That just means label equal to label, this one right here. So a single, word here for that one. We can now say percentage. So the percentage is going to be calculated because votes is the, in this case for TypeScript, it's going to be 4. So we're going to have 4 as the votes and then total votes is going to be 11. So right here, we're just going to say, look, let's say 100 times the votes divided by the total votes, okay? Then once we have this here, we can now just say, look, okay, we have this or 0, okay? So what this is doing here is it's just saying, oh, where are we? Yep, there we go. So this here is saying, look, if we divide by 0, we're going to get not a number, okay? So in that case, for divisions by 0, in the case that you have no votes or no total votes, we're going to default to 0, okay? So that's purely to prevent our divide by 0 errors. We're now going to say, look, once we've got this percentage, we can just say toFixed as 0 to convert that percentage into a whole number, okay? So now we're done, all right? I'm going to restart the server, go back in Insomnia here, sends it across, and we get nothing because I didn't actually, send it across. So here we can just say response.json and pass in the data, which of course is going to then take our object and convert it into JSON. Let's try it again, start it up and press send, and we get this right here. We get 0, 36, and 64. So our data is now looking pretty good, all right? That is the first endpoint, a get request to /poll. The next endpoint is going to be the post request to, of course, add a new number to one of these options, okay? Now, for this one, I want to actually write out the request first in Insomnia before working on the code for it. So I'll duplicate this request here. Okay, and we can make this a post request to /poll. So keeping the same, endpoint here, or the same route, whatever you want to call it. Now, inside the body, form URL encoded. So remember, the front end is going to be, sending across this data as a form URL encoded as well. So we have this right here, and we're going to say add value JavaScript. This means let's add 1 to the JavaScript option, okay? I'll send it across, we get not found. So now let's define this endpoint to retrieve that data. Like I showed earlier, this line right here is going to allow us to receive that data, which we provided with this here. So now going right down here, underneath the app.get for poll, I'll minimize that. We can say app.post for /poll. So for this one now, once again, being asynchronous, we're going to receive the request and the response, okay? And now we can do a couple of things. The first thing is going to be to retrieve that data. So basically, it's the same line as above here. So I'll copy this line to retrieve that data from the JSON. Okay, we can just say const this time because we're not going to be reassigning the value like we did down here. So const data, retrieve that data, right? Okay, then we're going to say, look, data, then request.body.add ++. So let's just say I pass in JavaScript. Okay, so just like this here, add JavaScript. This code here is going to do this. Data for JavaScript ++. So if it's 0, going to make it 1. Okay? That's modifying this data object. It's inside the application as the script runs. It is not yet saved. So let's put this back to request.body.add to, of course, retrieve the user's input. Now you guys can also add validation if you want to. I'm not going to bother with today's video because, of course, I want to keep it relatively simple, but you guys can add your own validation. You can say, look, if the request body is not JavaScript, TypeScript, or both, then don't do anything. You can do whatever you want. But for today's video, I'm just going to keep it simple and add it and trust the user to provide the right value. Anyway, down here, we're now going to say, look, await fs.write file. We're going to write to the data file once again, and now we're going to just say here json.stringify to convert our data object back into JSON and save that updated numeric to that same data.json file. The downside to this is going to be that this is now going to be a one-line JSON because the JavaScript is generating it and not yourself. So we're going to see this convert to a single line, but that's okay. So now we're basically done. So we can just say now response.end. Okay, so simply just, we're going to save the data, then end the request. Okay, you guys can, you can add your own sort of, okay, it's all good, or vote successful, but I'm going to just end it here. I can close this off, I can restart the server, go back inside Insomnia, and now we can send it across and we get 200 OK, which means everything is OK. And going back inside here, now we can see it's a single line and we get 1 for JavaScript. Let's send it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Back in here, 6 is now for JavaScript. So the get and the send and the post is working. If I go back inside here and we send the request to get the poll, press send, we now get 35 for JavaScript, 24 and 41. So this right here is the majority of the work done for the backend. We're gonna come back later to simply fix a CORS problem, but for now, this is basically the chunk of the work when it comes to the server side. So we'll keep this server running and we're gonna close the terminal here. Okay, it's still running. Now we can simply go back inside the directories here and we can create a new directory called client to, of course, begin work on our client side. All right, so moving on to the client side here, we can now create a new file in the client directory called index.html. I've also just closed off all of the server side stuff for now. But going inside the index.html, we can now create a new HTML template, pressing exclamation mark and enter in VS Code to give us this right here. The title, we can just say voting system, and now we can use the live server extension to, of course, let us preview the results in the browser. So F1, open with live server, press enter, and now we have the index.html being served in the browser. And basically, going back inside the VS Code here, we can now sort of define a couple of files. So we're going to have a CSS file and a JavaScript file for this front end. So we can make a new file here called main.css and another one called main.js, of course, for CSS and JavaScript respectively. We can now include these two files in the HTML. We can say link to CSS going to main.css. Then we can just say script source going to main.js. And a very important thing here, the defer attribute, because this just means that this script is going to execute once the body has been loaded. All right, so there will be, you basically are going to avoid errors when it comes to things like, can't find element this or undefined property this, things like that. You avoid using defer. So we have the CSS and JavaScript included. We can now begin by writing out the HTML. If you watch my channel frequently, you know I like to do the HTML first, then the CSS, then the JavaScript. So when it comes to the HTML, let's create an example of what the poll is going to look like. So the JavaScript is going to be generating the options based on what the server gives it. But as an example, so we can see our CSS progress, we're going to be defining a couple of options inside here. So this div, the poll, is going to be our main container for the entire sort of front end. Okay, so the little box that I showed you at the beginning of today's video. Each option, so JavaScript, TypeScript, both, whatever it is going to be a div inside here. We're going to say here poll __ option. I'm using the BEM or block element modifier CSS class naming convention, but you can name these classes whatever you like. Okay, so this is a singular option. Now, inside the option, we're going to have a couple of things. The first thing is going to be the actual bar to, visualize the percentage. So that green bar or the gray bar, whatever state it's in. So for this, create a new div called poll __ option dash fill. It is the fill or the bar for the actual option. Okay. This right here is going to be an empty div. We're going to be using CSS to, of course, give it a background color, a width, and so on. Now, the second thing here is going to be a new div with a class of poll __ option dash info. So this here is going to be information related to that particular option. The label, JavaScript, for example, or TypeScript, or both, and the percentage. So here we'll just say span with a class of poll __ label. We can say as an example, TypeScript as the option. Let's duplicate this line and say poll __ percentage. For TypeScript, we can just say, let's actually test our API again. So we get 24. So let's make it 24%. Okay, just like that. So now this is the HTML for the poll. We can make a second option here. And we're going to be giving this or the label of JavaScript as the option, right? And we can say, what is it? 35, so 35%. Also, I'm just using these values here just because I want to. Of course, when we actually get the application running, it's going to fetch this data from the server side, so don't worry. In fact, you know what? I'm going to make this 10% and I'm going to make it 80% just to prove a point. So we have the two options. Now, the JavaScript, let's just say the user has chosen JavaScript as their option to the, towards the poll. In that case, give it a class of poll -- selected. So basically, the JavaScript is going to allow the users to click on the item, and then it's going to add this class to that particular option if they've selected it. So we're going to see what a non-selected item looks like and a selected item looks like. Okay. So speaking of what things look like, going inside the CSS here, we can now begin styling up these classes or these components or elements, okay? So for this, you know what, I might actually just stop here. I want to go in the browser and just see what we have. So we have this right here in the browser after writing out that HTML. So of course, we're going to convert this right here to look like what I showed you at the start of today's video. Going inside the CSS file, we can now target the class of poll. So for that main container, let's give it a width of 400 pixels, a padding of 1.5 rem. Now, rem refers to the root font size. So basically, in many browsers, if not all of them, 16 pixels is the font size on the body tag. So basically, we're just saying here, look, 1.5 times 16, whatever that is, I think it's like 24. That's going to be the padding for this poll. The reason for using a relative unit like this is because if you update the font size in one place, want it to actually update for the poll as well. So you can use 24px if you want here, up to you, but I'm going to use rem. A margin here of 50 pixels. You can also argue to use rem here if you want to, but anyway, a margin of 50 around the whole poll. A font family of sans serif or your own font of choice. A box shadow here of 00, 20px, RGBA 000, 0.15 for 15% box shadow. Okay. Also, a border dash radius of 10 pixels. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here. So looking not too bad so far, of course. Now we can move on to styling up something I missed actually. I missed the poll title. So inside here, we have all of the options, right? Let's add a new element to the top here called poll __ title. Let's say here, which do you prefer? Just like the beginning of today's video. That is our poll's title. Back in the browser, and we get this here. So my mistake, I'm sorry guys, but now we can start styling up the CSS for this title. Back inside the main.css file, we can target the class of poll title. For this one, we're going to say font weight bold. We're going to say font size 1.5 rem, just like the padding right up here, and a margin bottom of 1.5 rem also. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here. That is all when it comes to the title. So now we can begin to style up the actual options and things inside here. So there are actually quite a few things going on here. I want to firstly just target the poll __ option dash fill. So just styling up that actual bar to visualize the percentage. So for this one, we can say width of 50%. So by default, when the browser first loads this page and the data is not yet retrieved, we're going to give it a width of 50%. This is just to have something visible in case the server side is taking a while to respond. To be honest, you wouldn't actually get things inside here if the server wasn't responding. So I take that back, but look, it's just a default here so we can actually see what it's going to look like, okay? Now, a height of 10 pixels and a background of a very light gray. Also, just for some context, guys, this width is going to be essentially set using the JavaScript. So whatever the server side responds with right here, so 35, 24, 41, whatever it responds with, it's going to take this number and put it inside the width for that particular options fill. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here. So of course, just the default value of 50% just to visualize what it's going to look like. Okay, now we can now drop down here. We're going to say poll __ option dash info. For the information section underneath, I'm going to display this as a flex with a justify content of space between. These two properties here are going to make it so the label's on the left side and the percentage is on the right side. Back in the browser, and we get just we get just that. Okay, cool. So label and percentage. Back inside here, we can now just say a padding of 0.5 rem top and bottom and 0 left and right, and a font size here of 0.85 rem for a slightly smaller font size. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here. So now we are mostly done with the CSS. The finishing touches here is going to be to simply grab onto the poll option. So I'm going to say here, poll __ option. When hovering over an option, we're going to simply say cursor of pointer. Save this back in the browser. We can see now we get that change of cursor to indicate that yes, you can actually click on this particular option. Okay, next one here is going to be poll option, then say colon not, then last child. So this here is saying, look, get me every single poll option that is not the last poll option. Okay, so in this case here, it's going to only be the first poll option right here. The last one is not going to be selected. So for these ones, we can add some space between those options. So we can say here, margin dash bottom of 0.5 rem. So now we can see we get a nice bit of space between the first option here and the second option, just like that. You got that orange margin right there, as you can see, but you don't get it on the bottom one. Okay, cool. A few more things here. That is in relation to the selected state. So if you actually selected one of the options, we can just say here, poll __ option dash selected, then target the poll option fill. So for a selected options fill, we can change the background color. We'll say background, then 009578, that is the dcode green color. Save this back in the browser and we get green for our selected option. Remember, the JavaScript is going to be adding this class to our div when clicking on that option and of course sending it to the server side. Cool. Back inside here now, one last thing to do for the selected poll option is going to be targeting the info, and we're going to make the font weight bold. So font weight bold, save this back in the browser and we get bold right there. Okay, so we are all done with the HTML and the CSS, but the JavaScript, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be generating this HTML, so these options and this title. So we're going to be removing all of this stuff right here very shortly, but I'll keep it in here just for reference, okay? So now it's the main event, the JavaScript, okay? Going inside the main.js file, we can begin by defining a new class called poll. This class is going to contain all of the code relating to the poll or the voting system, whatever you want to call it, okay? Now, it's going to have a constructor. The constructor will take in the root element and the poll's title, okay? We can say here, this.root is equal to root, just to keep a reference to the root element. Now, what is the root element? It's going to be this div right here with a class of poll. So, like I mentioned earlier, all of this stuff here is going to be removed. So we're going to pass this div into the constructor here, just to then, allow this class or an instance of this class to populate the HTML inside here and do things. Okay. So let's go down here, right? I'm going to say now const p, short for poll, okay, equal to a new instance of poll. We're now going to pass in that root element. So we'll say here document.query selector, selecting every single, sorry, not every single, but the first element with a class of poll. Of course, this is going to simply return us the element for this one right here, this div. And a second argument here, it's going to be the title. Which do you prefer? Just like that. So now we have, of course, our instance of the poll. Inside here now, we can begin to do, of course, or begin to write out the logic for the front-end JavaScript. So a few more things inside the constructor here. Firstly, we're going to say this dot selected is equal to session storage dot get item poll dash selected. So what is this right here? Okay. When you click on the item to vote, one of the options, right? The JavaScript is going to remember what you chose. That's how it's able to then say, look, okay, you chose JavaScript. Because I hosted the previous server showing you guys the finished product at the start of today's video, essentially, if I go in the network tab, if I go in the application tab right here, we can see that in session storage, we get nothing. So forget what I just said. But look, essentially, we're going to save our chosen option in session storage. And this means that as long as I'm in the same tab here, this JavaScript is going to remember which item I chose. So as an example here, we're going to say poll-selected as the key, give it a value of JavaScript. So now when this code runs, session storage.getItem for poll selected is going to have a value of simply the string JavaScript. All right, cool. So with this data, we can now say, look, okay, you chose JavaScript, therefore let's add the class of -selected. So that is what this is doing. It's also going to prevent users from clicking on a item after they've already selected one previously. Okay, so let's say here also this.endpoint is equal to http://localhost at port 3000/poll. So we're simply keeping a reference to the endpoint, which we of course are running on the server right now. It is still going right down there. Okay. So we have our main instance properties defined on the instance of poll right down here. I'll just console.log p just to see our progress, okay? Save this, go in the browser, and we can see here we get the instance of poll. The endpoint is of course the string there. The root is our div, and selected is currently JavaScript. If I go back in application here and change this to be TypeScript, refresh the page, the console will now say TypeScript. So it's simply retrieving that data. Now, when the page first loads up, this is going to be empty. So if I delete this item right here, refresh the page, selected is null. That is what is going to be the default state of the application. So you get null for selected, which means now we can actually start to choose some items. But let's make that work first. So down here, we can now say this.root.insert a JSON HTML. And we're going to say here, after begin, then inject some HTML. We're going to be using the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard. This is just referring to the JavaScript template strings, which allows us to have multi-line strings and also pass in some data. So we'll say here div with a class of poll__title. Then inside here, using the $ and curly braces, we can just say title. So simply creating a new div, our poll title, and inserting that after the beginning of the root. Of course, we're simply just getting that HTML and adding it as the first element right after the beginning of that div. So if we do this, it's going to add one of these. Okay, save this back in the browser and we get 2. Okay, so 2 titles. So of course we can simply just remove our title from earlier on and let the JavaScript handle it based on what we pass in down here, back in the browser, and we get that right there. Cool. So next step is going to be to call a method called this._refresh. So the refresh method is the single method in the class here. It's going to call the API and retrieve the votes and the options. Okay, so I'll minimize this, but just know that when the class first gets created, it's going to refresh that data. So let's define this refresh method right here. Also, if you guys aren't too comfortable with JavaScript classes, I've got a whole video dedicated to it, which of course covers the constructor, the methods, the instance properties, and things like that. But essentially, this method is going to contain all the code for refreshing and getting the data from the API. So this is going to be an asynchronous method. So I forgot to say async right here, because just like in the server side, we want to make use of promises and have neat code when using asynchronous operations. So the first step is going to be to call the API, make a request to that endpoint, and retrieve the data as an array. Back inside here, we can say const response is equal to await fetch. Going to be fetching here this .endpoint. Of course, this is just simply referring to that string. Okay, of the URL. Cool. So we're going to fetch that right there. Then we're going to say const data equal to await response.json. So take the data and convert it from a JSON string into a native JavaScript array. Console.log the data, save this back in the browser, and we get an error. So we have a CORS error here because our server does not allow us to essentially retrieve data or communicate with it when the origin is not the same. So to fix that, we can simply go inside the server code and we can add some middleware. I'm going to say right up here, enable CORS. Okay, so for this, we're just going to say app.use, then define this function. Going to have the request, the response, and next. Okay, so inside here, we're just saying, look, for every request that comes through, we're going to set a header, because in the browser, it says here, look, there is no access control allow origin header on the response. Also, just quickly, if you go in the network tab, we can see in the XHR fetch section, we do, of course, in the response headers, we don't get that header. So of course, that's what that means. So let's simply add this header in. Also, I've got a whole video dedicated to this particular header. If you're interested in how to, of course, solve that issue. But anyway, inside here, we can now say response.send, set header. That's the one. So set header, set the access control allow origin header to be an asterisk, which just means, look, I don't care where the request comes from. I'm still going to, allow the data to be sent back. Of course, this right here is enforced by the web browser. So that's why Insomnia still worked, because this doesn't care about that response. You can, I think, enable it to care about CORS, but it doesn't matter. The point is the browser doesn't. So by adding this header here and restarting the server, just like this, back in the browser, refresh, and it works now. So we don't actually get the console.log for some reason. So let's try and figure that one out. But network tab, we can see we get pending. Very interesting. Oh, my mistake, guys. I forgot to add down here calling next. So let's try again, restart the server, and now back in the browser, refresh, and it's fine. We get the console log of the data, which came from the server side. JavaScript, TypeScript, both, and the percentages. Cool. Also, quick thing in the response now, in the response headers, we get that header asterisk. Cool. So we have the data. We can now hop down here in the main.js, and we can now simply say something like this, okay? We're gonna say this dot root dot query selector all, selecting every single existing element with a class of poll underscore underscore option, and for each one of those existing elements, we're going to grab onto that element and just say option dot remove. Okay, so this right here is saying, look, when you refresh the data, let's clear out all existing options. Imagine you want to refresh the data twice. If you don't clear this div, then you're going to see all the options multiple times. So we're going to clear that data. If I refresh, or it's already refreshed, so we can see upon receiving that request, the data is going to be, or the options are going to be cleared. So we're going to keep this here just for now, just for more reference, but eventually we'll make this look like this, and that's fine. But anyway, I'll minimize the server in the terminal here. Cool. So back in the main.js, we can now simply loop over every single option coming back from the server side and simply, create new option elements for that particular item. Back inside here, we can say for of, okay, const option of data. Remember, data is an array of our three options, basically, this right here. For every single object inside this array, okay, option, we're going to say const template equal to document.create element, then pass in here template. So we're going to be using a template element in order to build up a new set of elements for our option. So we can now say const fragment equal to template.content. So now we can start interacting with and making that HTML based on the fragment here. So dropping down, we can now say fragment.innerHTML is equal to, then inside here, so my mistake guys, templates.innerHTML. Inside here now, once again using the template strings, so the multi-line strings there, we can take our option HTML right here, copy it and paste it inside here. And now, once formatted correctly, like this, we can begin to populate the dynamic data. So this label, we can use the $ and curly braces to simply take in, of course, that data. So it's going to be option.label. Remember, this option here refers to one of these, so option.label. Going to put it inside there as the span, and then as the percentage, option.percentage. Okay, now we're just going to say here as well, template string, and just say, oops, my mistake guys, no we're not, simply use a percent here. So the percentage from the server side, then a percentage sign. Okay, cool. This here is our, our HTML for our option. So next step is going to be to drop down here, and we're going to be setting some more things for the actual, elements here. So that particular thing is going to be the fill. So like I said earlier, this with the 50% on the fill is the default. So we're going to override this value in the JavaScript by saying here, fragment.query selector. Going to be selecting here the class of poll underscore underscore option dash fill. So for that fill div, we'll just say here style.width is equal to, then using template strings once again, we're going to say percent sign at the end, and then just say here option.percentage. So basically the exact same thing as right up here, but now setting it to the CSS style attribute or property. Okay. Cool. So now, dropping down here, we can just say this.root.append child. We're going to be appending that fragment. Okay. So now, we've built the HTML, and we're now adding it to the root. Of course, the root refers to our class of poll. back in the browser and we get this right here. As we can see, we have the 35 in the label, we have 24, etc. And we have those widths applied to those particular option fields. So far, it's looking pretty good. We can now remove all of the options from the container and we still get the same result. So the JavaScript is fully generating everything. Now, going back to the idea of selecting one of the options, I want to go back in the application local storage here and just simply add that key once again, poll-selected with a value of, let's just do TypeScript. So now we want, okay, TypeScript to be highlighted. Back inside here in the code for the HTML, we can go inside the class attribute of the poll option. We can say here, look, if this dot selected, so remember, this dot selected is going to have a value of TypeScript, as we can see right up here. So TypeScript selected. If selected is equal to option dot label. So if this current option is the one that you selected, then we're going to say, okay, cool. Let's add the class of poll __ option -- selected. Otherwise, the rest of them are going to have a class of empty string, just giving us the same thing as earlier on. Save this back in the browser and we get that class added to TypeScript right there. Cool. So we have a lot of the stuff complete. The last step now is going to be to simply do something and make the request to the server side when the user clicks on one of those options. So right down here, we can now say, if there is no existing selected option in the session storage, then we can add an event listener to our option. We're going to say fragment.query selector, then say here, the class of poll _ option .add event listener. The click event is going to fire off when the user clicks on a poll option here, we're going to run this function, okay? I'm going to say here console.log the option, just to demonstrate this. Now, of course, we have a selected item, so we won't actually get this working. So if I click it here, we can see it doesn't work. But if I remove the application session storage here to delete, okay, refresh, click it, and we get the option there. So I'm going to take this label and send it across to the server using that add in that post request right here. So back inside here now, we can simply say, okay, cool. You chose an item. So we'll say fetch this.endpoint, and then using the options here, we can say a method is going to be a post request. Okay. Also, the body here is going to be that URL encoded data. It's going to look like this, okay? I'm going to use the template strings once again, then say add is going to be equal to, and then pass in here option.label, okay? If you choose JavaScript, it's going to be add equals JavaScript, okay? Cool. Last thing here is going to be the headers attribute. We're going to simply say, yeah, look, the content type of this is going to be application /x -www -form -URL encoded. Make sure this right here is correct. This is just telling the server side that this body data here has a type of this. So based on this now, it's going to be able to parse your body and make it actually work. So we can then say .then. Okay, when the server side comes back and everything's all good, we can just say this dot selected is equal to option dot label. Okay, so simply updating that selected value to what you chose. Okay, then we can say session storage dot set item with the same key here of poll-selected, the same one used when getting that item right up here in the constructor. Okay. So we're going to set this value to be the option.label. That way, next time you refresh the page and this gets created once again, it's going to remember what you chose. Then lastly here, we can just say this _refresh to then refresh that data. Okay. So I can save this, go back in the browser, and we're basically done. Just for completeness, I'll remove the console log right down here and try again. So if I choose JavaScript 39, 22, 39, in the network tab of the developer tools, XHR, we can see there was a request, okay, a GET request. Why didn't the post come through here? Let's just, let's clear the session storage and try again. So I'll just delete this, keep the console open, preserve log, refresh, and now we can clear it up and we can send this one across JavaScript. There we go. So we can see there was a request to, oops, where is it? There it is, found it. So there was a post request here to, of course, the poll. The payload says add JavaScript. And of course, now in our JSON, that JavaScript is going to be incremented by 1. Okay, so that is how to create your own poll system as a web application using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Express, and Node.js. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, drop a like and subscribe. So I'll see you guys in the next one. And yeah, that's basically it.